if you had sort of one thing that was applicable to any entrepreneur in any type of business, it's this constant wheel of problem solving. If you don't solve the problem, you don't get paid.
I'm Amy Jo Martin. Welcome to the Why Not Now show. You know that thing you've been thinking about doing? Yeah, that one. Why not now? Have you ever actually taken the time to ask yourself, what's stopping me? Let's talk it through. This is your chance to give that idea the attention it deserves and take action. Each episode, I have a chat with a fascinating person, from entrepreneurs to athletes, celebrities, my parents, rocket scientists, and all walks of life. We talk through a critical time when they've asked themselves, why not now? We dissect that day or even that moment, step by step. Just let go. Hey everyone, we have Emily McDowell on the show today, and I cannot wait to tell you about her. Before I do, I'd love to give you a quick update on Lincoln Gray. If you missed it last week, I had Lincoln 3 months early. So our son was born. I was on a layover in Denver. Long story short, we are here. We live here now. He will be in the NICU for the next 3 months or so. And he's doing pretty well. And I just want to thank everyone for your love, your support, your energy that you're sending our way. It's working. Lincoln's progress is overall really positive. I think of it as kind of like a spreadsheet. And if we were to draw a graph based on all the data, the graph line would be up and to the right. So there are little bumps in the road, and sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that's to be expected for a little 2-pounder baby. But for the most part, it's up and to the right. And that's where we want that line going, is up and to the right on the graph. And we know that progress is not linear. It's not a straight line. We are settling into our new normal here in Denver pretty well, and overall, things are very positive. Lincoln's been opening his eyes a little more each day, and I swear he opens them mainly when his mama is around. Also, it's kind of interesting. The first time we got to do skin to skin, so the first time I got to hold him a few days after he was born, one of the attending doctors came around. He popped his head into Lincoln's pod and saw me holding Lincoln, and I said, Dr. H, do you think that he knows who I am? And with a little glimmer in his eye and a smile/smirk, he looked at me and said, yeah, pretty sure the mother-baby thing's been going on for millions of years. So we are bonding, and it's amazing. And if you'd like to follow Lincoln's journey, his hashtag is #BabyLincolnLogs. And we're on Instagram, Facebook, you name it. So switching gears to our guest today, Emily McDowell. Emily is a writer, and she is just an all-around creative who started a greeting card company and a gift company a few years back, and it has just exploded because she's taken a different approach. So the nicety kind of boilerplate cliche sayings you hear on a lot of cards, that is not Emily. She talks straight, and people have really responded to it in a big way. Emily has been featured in New York Times, Good Morning America, NBC Nightly News. She's been named by Slate as one of the 10 designers who are changing the world. I first met Emily or became aware of her at an event that we were both speaking at. It's called the World Domination Summit, and I think some of the listeners have been to this event. I was listening to her speak, and I was just kind of like taking some notes and doodling in my notebook, and then she said something that was extremely profound to me. She said, I was climbing a ladder that I realized was leaning up against the wrong wall. She was referring to working in the advertising industry as a creative director and writer, and she was climbing her way up that career ladder, chasing a promotion that she didn't even really want. And she realized, wow, my ladder's in the wrong place. That statement really summed up for me what I had felt for a while. And I know for many of you, you've told me and shared that you feel the same. So many of us have looked for career shifts and pivots, right? And whether that's in a big way and we're wanting to do something completely different, or it's just a small trajectory shift. One of the things that Emily was able to do, and that I'm a huge advocate for, is she didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of she didn't try and do a 180 and completely change everything she was good at and the experience she had in her career. She shifted focus and she adjusted the way it was being done in terms of creating her own company, but she still was using her systemic, just innate creative talents that brought joy. And so with that shift, although becoming an entrepreneur is a big shift, obviously, her shift in skills and talent just were amplified. They weren't kind of just thrown to the wayside, and she didn't try and do a 180 necessarily. And I bring that up because when I had a pretty decent size redream career shift, I kind of thought I needed to do that 180. And I ended up coming back around to a similar place that I was prior. It just looked differently because I was working with different people. So that might be something that you think about as you could be considering a career shift. In this episode, we cover a lot of ground. We talk through how big life events can really change your direction and perspective in terms of what impact that has on your day-to-day and how you spend your days, how you spend your career. Emily has a really fresh view on what innovation really means. And sometimes we think of innovation as fancy technology or needing a lot of cash to innovate a product or design. And actually, she's been able to do this in a very simple way, yet the leaps and bounds she's creating with the innovation of her content and writing and the way she makes people feel is extreme. Finally, one of the things we touch on is Emily has kind of a bit of a disclaimer when she talks about entrepreneurship, because she's been known to say, monetize your joy with caution. Meaning sometimes when we start to monetize what makes us happy, when a hobby that turns into a side hustle, that turns into a full-time gig or something that we love, there can come a point where you're actually pulled away from the task, the skill that you love, and pulled into the business side that you may not love so much. And so being mindful of whether or not something makes sense to actually pursue as a business model is something everyone should think about. For example, I love to knit and make jewelry. But in the past, I tried to make a little business out of my jewelry as a side hustle. And all of a sudden it turned into a job, and I had to do it on demand quickly and other things that were involved with this little business, and I didn't love it. So monetize your joy with caution is something that she said, and I think it's really great advice. There is a way to do it for sure. We talk about that all the time on this show. We also, during this episode, do a bit of a deep dive into ways you can be cognizant of how you do it if you decide to. To get a better grasp of the creativity that Emily and her team are sharing with the world, you can head to Instagram and follow the business at Emily McDowell, MCDOWELL_. And then Emily's personal account, which is super fun to follow, is at Emily on Life. We tackle the most taboo topics on the Why Not Now show. Oftentimes, you're hearing guests share things they've never shared before. In the spirit of things we don't typically talk about, you should know that the Why Not Now show is supported by Poopery, the original before you go toilet spray. It's magic. My friends at Poopery have literally taken the smell out of you-know-what. This pure blend of essential oils stops bathroom odor before it begins. Visit poopery.com, and Why Not Now listeners get 20% off with code WHYNOTNOW. That's all one word. And you can hear the story about Poopery in our interview with founder Susie Batiste. That's Why Not Now, episode 28. Poopery is also available at Bed Bath & Beyond. Emily, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I look forward to this conversation with you. And let's get started as we do. In the spirit of Why Not Now, can you tell me about a time when you had a big decision to make and you had to ask yourself, why not now?
Yes. So I think that my biggest why not now, or at least my biggest professional one, came in 2011. I had been working in advertising since 2003, and I had gone to school. I'd gone back to school in my mid-20s to get a portfolio degree in advertising. So I had worked my way up at ad agencies for about 8 years, and I was a writer, or I was an art director, and then I became a writer, and then I spent all of these years working towards being promoted to being a creative director. And advertising is, if you've seen Mad Men, it's not pretty far off. It is a grind. It is a career that takes a lot out of you. It is overnights. It is 80-hour weeks. It is very demanding.
And I can relate. That's where I started too for the first 7 or 8 years. But on the account management side, so I just had these visions of that Jennifer Aniston movie, and it is intense. So I can totally relate, but it sometimes looks glamorized on the outside.
Oh yeah, and it is, and it's really not glamorous. But that was the career that I had chosen. That's another story that I will not get into. But that's the career that I ended up in, and that was where I had committed. I had said, okay, this is it. This is me. This is my identity. I'm going to be successful in this. Here I go. Like, I'm in it. And I had put in all of these years, from age 25 to 35, almost 35, building this career and becoming increasingly miserable. I moved around a bunch. I switched agencies. I moved cities. I worked on different accounts. I worked for different people, and it was just nothing really fixed it. I mean, like, the thing that everything had in common was me, which I was coming to realize slowly, but which I really didn't want to look at, because if this was not the right career for me, then what was I doing? And what was I had just put in, this sort of prime working life time, and so many thousands of hours, and I had sacrificed vacations and, you name it, to move ahead in this business that I was suddenly, or that not suddenly, but that I was starting to realize was maybe not ever going to bring me the thing that I felt like I needed. So in 2011, I finally got promoted to creative director, and I realized that promotion essentially gave me nothing, meaning in terms of satisfaction, in terms of it was not the magic bullet that made me suddenly look around and enjoy my job or enjoy the industry or find meaning in what I was doing. It just meant that I got an office and some more money. So I sat with this decision for a long time of, but what do I do if I leave? Because these are my skills. I haven't taken math since 10th grade. I didn't think of myself as an entrepreneur. And I felt like I was walking away from this thing, or I felt like I knew I would be walking away from all of this work that I'd put in. And what did that mean? And who was I going to go be? And what was my identity? And would I have to start again at the bottom somewhere? And all that. A couple of things happened that made me just decide to quit. And I also want to say, like, when I quit, I knew that I could freelance for, an unspecified amount of time. It wasn't like I was quitting and, like,
You had a safety net.
Had nothing.
Right.
You know, I had somewhat of a safety net. I had a financial safety net in that I could freelance, you know, not forever, but that I could go and make money and pay my rent if I needed to. It wasn't a total financial stepping off a cliff.
Mm-hmm. Which is important.
Which is very important. Which is very, very important.
Yes.
Very important. But it was much more about realizing I want to do something else. And I have no freaking idea what that is. And I have no idea what direction I want my life to take. I don't even know what I like to do because all I've been doing for 10 years is this. And it was 2011. So it was a slightly different time in that there was a lot less out there about entrepreneurship and less of a community of people who were kind of taking the leap into starting their own thing, or less of a visible community anyway. And I really had no idea. And one of my college roommates, one of my best friends from college, got cancer, and she died 4 months later in 2011. And that was sort of wake up call number one. And then wake up call number two was the day after Christmas. I was walking across the Golden Gate Bridge with my childhood best friend who was in San Francisco for the first time ever. And we intercepted a guy who was in the process of jumping. And he had climbed over the railing and had climbed down and was sitting on a beam underneath the bridge. We ended up, you could only see him if you were like lying down. Basically, we walked past this guy in the middle of the bridge, and my friend turned to me about 100 feet later and said, something didn't feel right with that guy. And we turned around and he was gone, and his jacket was on the sidewalk. And so we ran back to where he had been, and he had climbed down. And so the only way to kind of see him was to get down on the ground and sort of yell down to him. And so we did that, and we called the bridge police, and the bridge police came, and the guy didn't want to talk to the bridge police. He only wanted to talk to us. And we stayed there with him for about 2 hours. It got dark. It was freezing. It was December. He was in shirt sleeves. The bridge was closed. The bridge officer guy was probably 22 years old and just really didn't know what to do. There were boats circling around below. You know, the police boats were out. And this guy kept talking about how he had just made mistakes. He had made mistakes that he couldn't come back from. And the story, I wish that it had like a neat ending. It doesn't, in that eventually one of the highway patrol supervisors arrived maybe 2 hours into this and was like, what are these women doing here? Get them out of here. They can't be here. And made us leave, escorted us off the bridge. And we were never able to find out what happened to the guy. Like, we tried to follow up with the SFPD and the state police and like all of the different entities, and nobody could tell us what happened. But those two things happened really close together. And for me, I think that those were really precipitated that decision to just walk into my boss's office and say, you know what, like, thank you for this promotion that I worked really hard for and that I lobbied for, you know, for a long time, and that you finally gave me, and that I've been doing this new job for 2 months, and I'm quitting.
Wow. And what's interesting is when, so you and I both spoke at a conference a few years ago, the World Domination Summit, and you said something on stage. And I remember kind of just having my notes out and like, you know, listening passively. And then you said that you felt like you were climbing up the ladder and the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. And I remember like physiologically being just sparked by that. My head popped up, my ears perked up, like as if there were a cartoon, you would have seen them go whoop, you know. I heard alarm bells going off, ding, 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 you nailed it, because that's such a great description of how so many people feel. And that's how I had felt years prior when I had decided to start doing my own thing too. But it's interesting how, your perception was you had spent, from 25 to 35 doing this thing. And then you were taking this completely different step in a different direction. But these two pivotal events were enough to kind of push you forward. And so do you remember, was it a pretty quick decision-making process for you? Because you had already been, it sounds like
it was pretty quick.
Been brewing.
It was basically like as soon as, how sometimes as soon as you give yourself permission internally to think something and to think that something is possible, then it will go really quickly from there. Like it's that for me, that was the biggest thing was allowing myself to think I could quit this job.
And then the floodgates were open. It's like,
and then it was like, okay, yep, I'm quitting this job. I'm quitting this job, and I'm quitting the job not in order to go get another one. I'm not going to go interview at different agencies. I'm going to go. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to freelance when I need some money, but I know that that's not something I can't. That's not going to be a career path. So what am I going to do?
And I think what you'd said earlier too about looking back at your patterns, the thing that everything had in common was you. And so I know we'll probably end up circling back there, but it was interesting to hear you say that because you were it sounds like you were hesitant to look inside because the patterns were there and you were chasing this promotion that you actually didn't even want. And so then what?
So then I had time and free time for the first time since, in 10 years. And I started thinking about like, well, what even makes me happy? Like, what do I love? Like, what are the things I love? And I read some article about like what to do with your life when you have no idea what you want to do. And one of the things that it mentioned was to revisit the things that just brought you joy as a kid without the idea of monetizing them or, just like, what were those things? Like, what did you love to do? And the things that I loved to do as a kid were writing and drawing pictures. And so I started writing and drawing pictures. I mean, I started just drawing comics. Like I started drawing things that I thought were funny. And I didn't really have much of a plan around it. I wasn't planning on monetizing it. I just was doing things for my own enjoyment, really. And then the more I started doing it, friends were encouraging me to put them on a Tumblr blog. And so I did that. And then I was starting to really realize that the things that I most loved, I loved lettering and drawing and writing, but I also really, the thing I loved about advertising, the thing that drew me to advertising to begin with, besides health insurance, was psychology, was like why people do what we do and thinking about human motivation and thinking about relationships. The thing that combined all of those things was greeting cards, because it was art and it was writing and it was relationships and why, and but I was like, how do you make a living selling something that costs $4?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
you were used to selling big ad campaigns for a lot of money.
Yeah. And just like, that doesn't make any sense. And like, if I could sell a print for $25, why wouldn't I do that? Like, why wouldn't I draw something and sell it, for $25 when I like, instead of selling this little $4 card that has to have an envelope. And like, I was so not, I wasn't thinking in terms of a business and systematizing. I was thinking in terms of one person sitting in her apartment, which is what I was at the time. That was really how it started, was going back to what I had felt drawn to do as a kid, and then what was feeling fun for me.
And is it safe to say that at the same time you're still grieving? Were you feeling that the layered, you're exploring what you were doing, what you enjoyed doing as a child, but did you still have a fairly heavy cloud of grief at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it was confusing. It was grief, and I mean, grief is never not complicated, but it was complicated in that Amy had died. My friend's name was Amy. Amy had died, and that was really difficult and terrible. And it also had I had cancer when I was 24, And my response to, I had a year of chemo and radiation and then went into remission. And my response to that was to go into advertising. Like I think I said, I have a talk in one of my talks, I joke about how I'm probably the only person in history to ever have a brush with death and then go into advertising, like usually the other way around.
Yeah.
But for me, it was, I need health insurance. Like I want stability. I saw this as like a stable, secure career. I want stability. I want health insurance. I want to put this behind me. Like I don't want this to be my identity. I don't want this survivor identity. I want to just be a regular person. And so it was all of the emotion that came up around her and my relationship with her and grief for her. And also sort of it was almost like a delayed reaction to my own having survived.
Mm-hmm. Like the response, your initial response of your own experience and maybe reflecting on it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the reason I asked that question is because I remember in just knowing a bit about your story, it seems like as you were going through this, you were looking for some sympathy cards, or you were almost just kind of going through the thought process of, wait, there is no good sympathy card. Like they're all just kind of bullshit. And at what point did this come into your exploring this new passion that you remembered as a kid? Like when did it click of, oh, wait, I could put these two together? Actually,
the sympathy card piece wasn't what we initially launched with. The sympathy card piece did come in, and it came in pretty quickly. I mean, I remember it was a combination of my own experience with getting get well cards when you have like something that you might not get well from is like, cool, thanks. Like I'll try, like it's not, like it's like there wasn't much. I mean, I remember, the experience of receiving those. And then when Amy was sick, witnessing the same thing that happened, which was people not knowing what to say and people not knowing what to do and not knowing how to be with her and not having the words to support her. And there being not a lot in terms of cards, even those quote unquote sympathy cards are such a thing, that there wasn't a lot that really offered much in the way of actual connection or assistance in that way, which actually really fit into this thing that I saw at the time. And the card industry is very different now. But at the time, the whole card industry was still, pretty dominated by Hallmark and American Greetings, which it kind of still is, but meaning that stuff was it was all really aspirational, right? So cards were about the relationships that we wish we had. So like these idealized versions of like gushing love poems for Mother's Day and, like just these like versions of relationships that are just aspirational and that don't necessarily reflect the reality of most people. And I had always struggled with finding cards that I felt represented my reality. And so when I was thinking about what I like to do, the intersection of what I like to do and what I'm good at, and where I see an opportunity to contribute something and to maybe build a brand or do something different than what was already out there. The cards were the intersection of that. And it wasn't just the sympathy cards, it was love cards. I mean, it was, what do you get the person on Valentine's Day that you're kind of dating, but like not really? Where is a card for that? Do you because the choices were you either give them nothing and then that's maybe weird because maybe they give you something and then, then that's awkward, or you give them a card that's like a regular love card and then you give them a speech like, oh, this isn't that big of a deal. I don't
totally. Got this dissertation accompanying this card that doesn't make sense.
Totally. That doesn't make any sense. And then you feel like a dummy and so it was really this sort of holistic observation about there really needs to be, the way that we communicate now is really different than the way that we communicated 30 years ago. And the card industry didn't feel like, it felt to me like it hadn't kept up, cards were more of a social convention when they had the potential to be much more about connection. Those things all together were kind of something that drew me in. And we actually the first card that I ever did was a Valentine for the person that you're kind of dating, but not really, which ended up going viral and was kind of my proof of concept to develop all the other stuff.
And it said, do you mind sharing what the key message
was?
No,
not at all. So it basically it was like the text of that speech, right? Like the speech that you give when you're like, oh, here's this normal card, but it's not that big a deal. So it said, I know we're not like together or anything, but it felt weird to not say anything. So I got you this card. It's not a big deal. It doesn't even have a heart on it. So basically it's just a card saying hi. And then in little tiny letters at the bottom, it says, forget it. It's just this funny, like little, it's what you would say when you would give like a card.
It's acknowledging it too, and just saying what no one else is saying on cards, but they're thinking it, feeling it, and saying it out loud. It's just like, it's amazing how that was innovation. And it truly was innovation, but it was so obvious, yet not. Avoid it in an industry that's been around since paper.
Right. And like that is what is so interesting to me, is that at the time it was innovation, and that we think of innovation as having to be, tech or funded by venture capital or, some like big thing, but really innovation is solving a problem. And there's great thing about our culture is that there are an endless number of problems waiting to be solved, and that you don't actually need necessarily fancy technology or a ton of cash or, Silicon Valley investors or any of those things to do that.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. If you are digging this podcast, please do us a favor and subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. It just takes a moment and it means a ton to us. Also, after recording more than 100 episodes, I've created a bit of a cheat sheet on the top 5 things I've learned from renegades and how they get from idea to action, from dreaming to doing. I will email you the downloadable PDF when you subscribe to my newsletter. Just head to amyjomartin.com and click on Connect with Me. If you were to give like the movie trailer from this point of point A being your first viral card to today, which I know is not easy, and those are years. But things clearly resonated with a large group. But would you say they also grew organically, or can you kind of take us through the next several of years?
Okay, so we launched our wholesale. We meaning I, in my apartment, started selling cards online on Etsy at the end of 2012. And then in May of 2013, I launched my first wholesale collection at the National Stationery Show, which is a wholesale trade show in New York that happens once a year. And then everything sort of exploded from there. Like I came home from that show with 20 sales reps and $60,000 in orders, which is not a usual story by any means. And I hadn't printed the cards yet. And so I had to immediately get a space. Like I had thought I was going to continue freelancing, basically build this little stationery business out of my apartment, continue freelancing until I was able to quit freelancing and just sort of slowly transition. And what happened was I basically got a $30,000 Urban Outfitters order that they were going to cancel the order if it didn't ship in 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't even printed the cards yet. And the cards, you can't just, each card needs to be assembled with a sleeve, with an envelope and a plastic, and put in a plastic sleeve and sealed, and then have a sticker on it and put in a bag of 6. And so it's handwork. Like it's not just print a card and send it to Urban Outfitters.
Labor.
There's labor
nights.
and
sleepless nights.
There's lots, the time that it takes to put together all those things, 15,000 cards or however many it was. And I needed a space. I had this line of 40 cards, which was the kind of the minimum that I had discovered in my research that you should launch with for wholesale. And so I had done that. And then I had them offset printed. And so I had, 1,500 of each card printed. And then I had to add this Urban Outfitters order. And so I ended up with, 80,000 cards, meaning that's like 2 pallets, stacked chest high. And I didn't have anywhere in my apartment to put those. And so I had to get a space. And I live in Los Angeles, which is not a cheap place to live. So that is challenging. Then I had to get help immediately. And it was sort of like building the plane and flying it at the same time. And it's really continued that way for the last 6 years. I launched at wholesale. Meanwhile, the direct-to-consumer side of the brand continued to grow. And today we are about 50%, our revenue is about 50% wholesale and 50% direct-to-consumer, which is actually pretty unusual for a stationery company. And it's actually very challenging because it's a different customer. They want different things. The seasons are different. The way that they buy is different. The assets that you need are different. You need paper catalogs and trade shows for wholesale, and everything is online for direct to customer and social media. So it's really like running two businesses. I made some moves over the years to try to alleviate some of our back end. The hardest thing about growing the company was not the creative end. It was infrastructure, and just basically we grew so quickly in the first 3 years that we were a different company every 3 months, every 6 months. We grew out of 3 spaces. We built our own. We went from fulfilling orders ourselves, and then we sent everything to a third party warehouse, and then that didn't work. They just couldn't make it happen. And so we had to take it all back. And then we built our own warehouse in Las Vegas. And then I ended up partnering with another company to help alleviate some of the burden on the wholesale side. And they ended up they were really dishonest about where they were, and they ended up going out of business. And I had to scramble and liquidate my retirement and buy the company back. And then I ended up with something I hadn't wanted in the first place because I'd been trying to get rid of it. And, and then at the end of 2017, I merged with a company called Knock Knock, which is a publisher of gift books and notepads and stationery. They don't do cards, but they do like a lot of pads and journals and other paper products. They've been around since 2002. And the founder and CEO had been and is still a good friend of mine and is now my business partner. We merged with them at the end of 2017, and our brands are still completely separate, but we now share resources, infrastructure, backend, offices, warehousing, all of that.
All the stuff that you don't probably want to do because your creative hat gets worn thin when you do that, right? So it's like, wow. So and I didn't mean to cut you off there, but would you say that's pretty much it. And so now we're in a place where I finally am focusing more on the creative than I ever have. I mean, there were years where it was 15% of my time was because everything else was so needy, and I had all the employees reported to me. We were just in constant problem solving mode with manufacturing and infrastructure and sales and logistics. So now those things are other people's jobs, which is really nice. And my job is much more about creative directing the brand. I'm still doing a lot of the executing of the work, but I'm not doing all of it anymore. And I'm also doing overall strategy for both brands. So I'm sort of using a lot of the brand building skills that I learned in advertising, actually, and not just applying them to our brand, but also looking at the Knock Knock brand and looking at this overall strategy for both, which is something that's fun for me. So it's kind of come full circle in a way. Well, and let's talk about that for a second, because there's so many like comments and notes that as I hear your story, oftentimes we think, oh, we want to go do a 180 and do something completely different. But you really did not throw the baby out with the bathwater when you leaped off that ladder from advertising world. And thank goodness you didn't, because that's still, your GPS was on track in terms of what you love to do. It was just the execution environment, infrastructure, and maybe having a lot of bosses, including clients. But what's so cool is that this wasn't a 180. It was a pivot. The entrepreneurship was completely new in a 180. And gosh, you navigated that well, because with all of those trials and tribulations as you were cutting your teeth with the manufacturing and with the partners I can see how, especially as a creative, you could become disenchanted and just be like, this just isn't worth it. But you were able to see through, and then now you're using all this incredible experience and tapping into what you learned from the ad world. But I think what I'd love to explore a little bit more with you, just as we have just a little bit more time, is, and full disclosure, I want to tell the listeners, before we hopped on and started recording this, Emily and I talked a little bit, and you expressed a bit of a caveat, a disclaimer that I often feel and vocalize too, and that is entrepreneurship is not for everyone. And if in listening to Emily's story, she had to do a lot for a lot of years that she didn't want to do, right? That maybe would have even been considered similar to back in the days of on top of that ladder that you didn't want to be on. But I think what's so important about your story is that the intention in which you started, like the seed and where you started from, was so innocent that it was like this light that I feel like you could not, this eternal flame that led the way to getting you back to where you are now. Because if you had set out to monetize this right out of the gate and study the industry and did what had always been done, or I don't know, it wouldn't have captured your essence and your humor and your innovation. So it's just so important that you didn't set out to necessarily build a company at all, right? So let's talk a little bit about your feelings on this. And we live in a culture that romanticizes entrepreneurship. I mean, I lived in a startup community in downtown Vegas for years when I had my first company. And not to be total damper, but we had 3 suicides within the space of a year or two from entrepreneurs. Just, it is not to be just glamorized. Is that even a word, glamorized?
Yes, it
okay.
is a word. Yeah.
Okay. I'm like, I'll ask the writer. So let's just talk a little bit about that, because I think it's so important.
Yeah, I agree. And it's something that as entrepreneurship becomes more visible, more accessible, there is definitely a cultural movement towards sort of encouraging people to take this leap into entrepreneurship, which is all great, but it is very hard. And you have to love the process of constant problem solving. I think that if you had sort of one thing that was applicable to any entrepreneur in any type of business, it's this constant wheel of problem solving. If you don't solve the problem, you don't get paid. And that is something that is fun. And you can't just be like, well, cool, I want to do that for like 2 years. And then when that gets old, then I just want to like not do it anymore. Mm-hmm. Because it really doesn't work that way. And so I see a lot of people who are like, for example, if you love knitting hats and you make these amazing hats and people are like, oh my God, I want to buy that hat. I want to buy that hat. You should have an Etsy shop. You should do this. You should do this. You should like go on Fair. You should, start a hat company. If the joy that you get from knitting the hats is about the process of making the hats and not from all of the other stuff, like
what happens when you run out of yarn,
and the thing, like the right, and like like if your joy primarily comes from the process of making the thing or the craft, my advice is to just be very careful about what you decide to monetize into a business and what you decide to keep for yourself as something that you love. Because when you monetize something you love, even if you love it, like, I love I love writing, I love drawing, but I don't do them to relax anymore. And I used to, and I can't anymore because it's not relaxing for me. Mm-hmm. And I reached a place of such bad creative burnout where sitting in front of a blank piece of paper felt like digging a ditch. It's not digging a ditch. I mean, it's this amazing freedom, right? It's this it's this thing that I love, that I know that I love. And I reached a place with it where all of the joy had been squeezed out of it because of the pressure. Mm-hmm. And because I had 14 employees with health insurance who were depending on me to have ideas. And when you decide to monetize something that brings you joy, cool. And also having awareness that your relationship with that thing is going to change is really important. So in terms of like the entrepreneurship piece is so much less about, do I love to do this thing? And more about, do I love to also do all of these other things around it that are going to end up taking up the majority of my time and energy if I am making this into a business?
It's such a good point. And especially with all of the chase your passion and these inspirational just prompts that we hear constantly a lot of times on Instagram. But it's funny you use the example about knitting hats because I do knit, and I started making these hats that have little holes in the top where you can put your ponytail, and it was not my invention necessarily. I think I saw a pattern or something, but people started saying, create the Etsy shop and you should sell these hats. And I'm like, no, I've been here before. This is a hobby, because I did that with jewelry when I was thinking I wanted to make jewelry. And as soon as I had the pressure of having to create quickly for people who had orders, I didn't like it anymore because I couldn't. Yeah. So it's just it's like, is this a hobby, or have you really thought through what is going to shift if you turn this into a business?
We used to just be able to have hobbies and have it be fine.
And now they're all side hustles.
And something, right. Like there's the thing that I really think is so dangerous is this shift towards monetization of literally everything in our culture. If you love it, how can you make money doing it?
It's such a great point. And I attribute a lot of it. There weren't really such things as side hustles when I was starting my career and in college and stuff. And now, and those were hobbies. And now I don't feel like people of certain ages have hobbies. They have side hustles, and it's changes the relationship with the whatever it is that you love to do and that joy. So thank you for sharing your story. And I have just one quick question and then a couple of rapid fire questions, which we can jam through really quickly. But the humor side of things, did you always, is that just a part of your innate personality when you were a child too? Did you have this kind of?
Yeah, that's just my personality. Yeah. Like that's really just, it's really my personality. I mean, like, people have always said, like, you should do stand up, and like, oh hell no, I draw the line at like at doing that. I can stand up and talk at a conference, and like, there's a big difference between making a room full of conference people laugh and making a room full of like drunk people laugh. I mean,
no, I hear you.
The bar is just lower. Like when your only job is to make people laugh, I feel like the bar is real high, and. Yeah, just the humor has always been part of my personality. It's a really important coping mechanism for me. It's just sort of who I am. And I wouldn't, I
this is part of your essence.
So it's really just woven, it's evolved. It evolved to sort of weave its way into the brand just because that's what I read. That's what I respond to. And that's the kind of writing I like to do. And
that's awesome.
So yes.
That you're able to even thread that, for sure, that outlet and that layer of yourself and your personality into this. So a few rapid fire questions. What's one lesson you find yourself learning over and over, Emily?
Oh my God. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Oh, so good.
I think is just, I can't learn that one enough.
I love that one. I heard that from a gentleman several years ago when my company was growing quickly, and I thought, we want to start this new division because there's a land grab over here and we got to have this new division. And Casey Wasserman, thank God, he said, Amy Jo, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Okay, so pirates or ninjas, who's tougher and why?
Ninjas, because I feel like anytime you have the element of surprise, you have an advantage.
Ooh, that's good. And what keeps you up at night?
Gosh. Well, now that I'm 43, what literally keeps me up at night is when I have one drink. Alcohol. When you get old, apparently, your body does not like to metabolize alcohol. But what keeps me up, I've been thinking a lot about what my purpose is and what the next iteration for me will be personally about. I feel like the next iteration of my professional life will be much more about service and working with community without having a brand to sort of hide behind, meaning my knowledge versus having what people buy be like an exchange of goods. You know what I mean? And I've been really turning over what that looks like for me and how I can best serve.
That's really interesting.
Without just contributing more noise to the conversation.
That's really cool. It's very meta too, because your name is your brand and you recognize that. I know, I can imagine, but you recognize that you can hide behind your own name at this point because of what you've built. But that's really interesting. I look forward to watching that surface. And what advice would you give to your younger self?
I would say the things that you work really hard to suppress. So I spent a long time not valuing a lot of who I innately was, meaning I am innately a really sensitive person, a really intuitive person. I am not good at office politics. I don't have hard edges. And I spent a long time devaluing the things that I innately am and trying really, really hard to develop all of those other qualities that I felt were necessary in order to succeed. And I even went into, advertising is known for being a competitive, challenging, political, cutthroat kind of an industry. And I thought that I needed to cultivate all of these other qualities in order to be successful. And what I ended up doing for a long was really just living someone else's life for a long time. And so I would say to my younger self, the things that you are valuable. And they are actually, because culturally living in a patriarchy, we don't value a lot of these things. But actually, you will be, if you figure out how to use these things to your advantage and how to build a life around the sort of superpowers that your sensitivity gives you, you will end up being so much happier and in more alignment than you ever would be if you figured out how to play the game and played it beautifully. Someone else's game. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I sense that what keeps you up at night is potentially correlated to that last answer too, of what advice you would give to your younger self. It's pretty epic. And so interesting, kind of where you're going with being of service is just sharing this today. Thank you. This is of service. And I really appreciate it. And where can people follow you, find you?
Let's see. Well, our website is emilymcdowell.com. That's the brand. And then our brand Instagram is emilymcdowell_. And then I have a separate Instagram account that I actually just started about a month ago for personal writing that is not product driven. And that is at Emily on Life.
I've been following that one too. It's been fun to see that and just feel like you're like a little bit of an insider because you get to, it's like, behind the brand. Thank you so much for sharing, Emily. This has been insightful and so helpful, I'm sure, to a lot of people, including myself. And we will continue to follow your journey. And I appreciate your time and your candor.
Anytime.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the show. Hit me up on social media to let me know what you think. I'm at Amy Jo Martin on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I want to hear your Why Not Now moments so I can share them on the show. Just send me a note to whynotnow@amyjomartin.com. For show notes and other offers, you can visit amyjomartin.com/whynotnow. And while you're there, don't forget to sign up for my email newsletter for exclusive content and announcements. A big thanks to Rock Salt Music for all of the tunes by the talented John Coggins. And of course, a hat tip to Richard Brewer for editing and producing the show. I'll see you next time. And until then, why not now?